with all of our interest models, we've really used discrete increments of time. And so as we look at longer stretches of time or more frequent compounding, I'd like to take the rest of the tools of calculus and use them here. But that means I need to move from discrete to continuous behavior. So interest earned in some fraction of a year would be based on our accumulation function. That's the definition of change in accumulated value. That's the interest we earned. So what's the rate? If this is the interest earned, what's the rate? I need that base formula for interest, the one we used all the way back at the beginning of the semester. Interest is okay. So with it only writing A, I'm assuming a principal value of 1. Because there's no object in front of my A being multiplied, right? My accumulation depends on my principal. If I don't have anything, I'm specifying a principal of 1, which means that my rate would just be to take the interest amount and divide by time. But how much time has elapsed between those 2 points? All right, wait just a freaking second. I've seen that definition before. I'm going to make a tiny little change in notation. What's that? Every calculus bell in my universe is going, you've seen this before. What is that? That's the one I'd say, that's my derivative. As h goes to 0, that's a derivative. So this is our difference quotient. And letting h go to 0 would be the same as letting m go to infinity, which means I'd be computing my interest faster and faster and faster over shorter and shorter periods of time. This is going to give me a derivative. We're actually going to label this as our interest rate compounded infinitely often. Again, we talked about this as continuous compounding, but it turns out we can actually write this in terms of definitions like that. Now, we did that examination using L'Hopital's rule. I think we did that on Tuesday. But wait a minute, something prime over, I've seen that expression as well, haven't I? That expression is the derivative with respect to t of the logarithm of a of t. Because when you take the logarithm, you get 1 over x. So if you take the log of something, you get 1 over the something, and then the chain rule gives me the a prime on top. For some reason, actuaries don't want to use this I infinity notation. They tend to call this delta of t. Notice that is a lowercase delta. That's the instantaneous rate of interest per dollar of investment. And it's called the force of interest. That's why I've divided by A of t here, is to give it per dollar of investment. Page 38 is a box defining this formally. But let's see if I can make this relative to something we already understand. I really need my A function to be differentiable for this to make any sense at all. So I'm going to use nice continuous functions. This is used for models of investments of derivatives of securities. So if you've heard talk about financial derivatives, where you're taking the value based on something else, a mortgage-backed security, for example, stock options, those are all using this sort of idea. So let's think about simple interest. My formula for an investment of 1 for simple interest. A equals, what's my simple interest formula? By the way, while you're doing the problems out of the book, while you're reading through the text, you should be building a formula sheet. You should be using the ACTEC formula sheet that's on our Canvas page, because you'll get the opportunity to use that on an exam, and you'll get your own formula sheet on that exam. You just can't have any worked out examples. What's the formula for simple interest?
A equals P times 1 plus RT.
Now, when we did our calculation up here, we made the assumption that principal was 1. So I'm just going to use 1 plus RT. Well, that's a continuous function of t. What's its derivative? So there's my force of interest formula. The force of interest is R over 1 plus RT. Now, our textbook actually uses I instead of R in this problem. So they'd write I over 1 plus IT. Big deal. I don't care whether you use R or I in this situation, as long as we know we're talking about the rate. Yes, ma'am.
So then, in earlier notes, when you're using I, like, it's not a rate of interest rate, like that's also R, like I.
It's a rate most of the time. You'll see. One of the textbooks I used specified that R was only to be used for annual rates and I was to be used for everything else. This book doesn't really care. It uses I almost all the time. I'm still stuck on R. Wait a minute. What's that graph going to look like? For any value of R, what's this graph going to look like as a function of t? The bottom is really just number x, linear function of x, right? Number of x plus 1. So let's just make it simple. Let's call it x. And then the top is just a number. So this looks like number over x. For those of you that have done such things, this is big O of 1 over x. What's the graph of 1 over x look like? It's kind of like 1 over t. So what should that graph look like? I'm never going to care about negative time. So I'm just going to use this part. But wait a minute, that means as time goes on, this force of interest gets smaller and smaller. Simple interest is less powerful for longer periods of time. Oh, okay. That's important. And that's one of the reasons that in long time behavior, we tend to use compound interest because this is less powerful as we get to longer periods of time. So let's look at compound interest. Let's try and do the same thing for compound interest. Again, I am going to assume a principal of 1. If I do that, what's the formula for compound interest? E.
One plus R, yeah.
Aha, but I'm doing it in terms of t. So I'm going to write it as 1 plus I or 1 plus R to the t. Okay? Because now I'm not thinking of this with fixed rate. I'm thinking about this continuously. What's the derivative of that? That's an exponential equation. The derivative of e to the x is, but this is not e, it's something else to the x. So I need to use my change of base formula. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to rewrite it as e to the ln of 1 plus I, that's a number, times t. So Maria, you said the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. This is e to the stuff. What's the derivative of e to the stuff?
The.
Right, chain rule. So I'm going to get the same thing and then the derivative of the stuff. But remember, the stuff is ln of 1 plus I. That really looks like 1 plus 1. Let me make the dot a little clearer there. Ln of 1 plus I is a number times t. So the derivative of number t is just number. What's my force of interest? Delta t is a prime of t over a of t is which is a constant, isn't it? That's just a number. Which means, compared to the simple interest case, simple interest gets less forceful as time goes on. Compound interest stays the same as time goes on. It's more powerful. It's constant as opposed to a decreasing function. Oh, hey, wait a second. Wait a second. I have a sneaky comment. Taking this derivative is a pain in the neck, right? Taking the derivative of 1 plus I to the t. But this formula is also the derivative of ln of a of t, right? What's ln of 1 plus I to the t? There's a property of logs here.
T times.
Powers jump out front, right? I want to take the derivative of this. This is number times t. What's the derivative of that? It's ln of 1 plus I. I could have avoided this if I'd used this version of the definition. You sneaky motherfucker. If I know the force of interest, by the way, force of interest can be manipulated and constructed. You can create investments that have particular force of interest. I can describe an investment's growth using an integral because this is the rate of growth. By definition, the net change is the integral from A to B of the rate of change. I'm going to integrate this thing. But that's the integral of a derivative. Whoop, I forgot the ln. There. Which means when I integrate a derivative, the integral and the derivative cancel each other out, and I get this thing evaluated at those ends. Now, again, I'm going to be sneaky, and I'm going to say, hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Property of logarithms. I'm subtracting. What happens? Divide. And A of 0 was my initial value, my principal. So this measures my growth relative to my principal logarithmically. Which means another way to write this is that A of n is A0 times the exponential of this integral. And that is my future value. Hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is my present value, e to the rate times time. Remember we talked about continuous compounding, having a formula that looks like principal, e to the rate times time. Well, here's e to the rate times time. If my rate's a constant, when you integrate, you get RT. This is exactly what continuous compounding should look like. There's an example in the textbook that uses a linear function for force of interest here. 0.8 plus 0.05t. We integrate from 0 to 5. You make an investment at time 0 of 1,000, then you'll go from 0 to 5. But if you make that investment at time 2, instead of at time 5, but it's 5 years long, you'll go from 2 to 7. So you can now block out any time period you want to do an interest calculation, but instead of doing some convoluted sum of stuff, you're doing an integral, which I think is much more convenient because I'm a math guy and I like doing calculus. Questions? Right, because what we're doing now is instead of saying our rate is a fixed number, we can have any function as a rate function. That's our force of interest. So our force of interest is playing the idea of our rate function. As a matter of fact, let's expound on this a little further and think about what happens if our force is just a constant. So let's just use delta without the t on it. It'll be a number. Then, using this formula, an is a0 times the exponential of the integral from 0 to n of a number dt. But the integral of a number is number times t. There's this formula showing up right there. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot that we're going to n. So I have to evaluate this from 0 to n, which makes this a0 e to the delta times n minus delta times 0. Times 0 is just 0. Consider our regular compound interest formula. Our regular compound interest formula would say that an is equal to a0 times 1 plus I to the n. So let's make these two equal to each other. I need another rule about exponents. How do I get rid of that nth power on the left?
Oh, no, that's not.
That only works for logarithms. There's no logarithm here. I want to get rid of this nth power. I need an nth root. Nth root is the same as multiplying by what, as raising to what other power, which means I do a 1 over n on this side. And that means that the n on this side and the n on this side cancel each other out. And I get 1 plus I is e to the delta. Or delta is ln of 1 plus I. There's my compound interest formula again. Staring me right in the face. A constant force of interest means I'm using regular compounding. If I am working on very short periods of time, I might as well consider my force of interest to be constant. Let's say I'm just loaning you money till tomorrow. Well, then I just 1 day's worth of interest. It's a very short number. I could use an actual I-365. Take my interest rate divided by 365 and do the calculation. Or I could use this and say we're just going to make the continuous approximation rather than the actual discrete version. So there's an example again in the text. I'm just going to write it up here real quick. My overnight rate is 12%. By the way, this is a very high overnight rate. But given banking right at the moment, this could be a reasonable overnight rate. What's my interest charged overnight? I'm a big bank. I'm borrowing 10 million bucks. Why might you have a large loan like this? What's a justification that you can imagine that you need $10 million today that you won't have until tomorrow? Payroll gets paid at the end of the month, right? Deliverables usually get paid on the first of the month. So I borrow money to make my payroll and then pay it back the next morning when my deliverables come in. This happens all the time with giant businesses, and that's why numbers like $10 million to make payroll tonight ain't a bad thing. So if I use an overnight loan, I can do I-365, which would be 0.12 over 365, and then the interest would be principal times rate times time, which is 10 million times 0.12 over 365. Now that's the rate per day. So my time will be in days, and it's just 1 day. What's the interest I pay on this $10 million loan? $3,287.67. Okay. If instead of using the daily rate, I use force of interest, instead, then I can say, oh, the interest earned will be 10 million times the integral minus the original 10 million, right? Because all I want is the interest. I don't want the whole future value. I just want the interest. Point 12. No. 0.12 over 365 minus 1. That minus 1 is to take off the original value. I'm looking at this and my brain just choked. No, that's right. Because I need the over time, right? I'm integrating, let's scratch. 10 million e to the integral from 0 to 1 over 365. That's where it goes. 0.12 dt minus 1. I skipped a line in my notes, so I was crossing things. I don't have the integral, I have the result of the integral. Because when I integrate this, I get 0.12t. When I plug that in, e to the 0.12 over 365. That's the answer that comes out. Sorry, I mixed up two lines. I apologize. Talk to me.
For the integral,
Yes,
the n is, what does it stand for?
the number of years we worked. How many years did we go? We went 1 day, 1/365th of a year. Yeah, well, because my rate is assumed to be annual, unless specified otherwise, when I'm doing force of interest. Again, my question is, what's the value of this interest? E to the 0.12 divided by 365 minus 1 times 10 million. The difference is about 50 cents. Whether I use the discrete version or the continuous version. Now, I will freely admit, in today's computerized driven banking system, using the actual daily rate is easy. I'm remembering doing this, I apologize for groaning about it, 30 years ago, when the best calculator I had was not a grapher, didn't really always have an E button on it, and sure as hell didn't have any of these business functions built into it. I had to do a bunch of this with tables and a slide rule. I mean, we did this by hand. We've been doing this for decades and still coming up. This is a faster method than writing out all the decimal places involved in doing 0.12 over 365. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just a little confused on the -1.
Oh, because I only wanted interest, and interest is an minus a0, right? So that would be a0 e to the integral delta dt minus a0, right? So I just factored out the a0.
Okay, yeah.
I could have taken away the parentheses and written minus 10 million.
Yeah.
That would work the same way. Here's the real kicker. Calculus gets me better estimates in the long run because I can cut things much finer. My model of being discrete can cause me some headaches, especially if I do stuff that isn't an exact number of periods. Do you all have a credit card? If you use your credit card, then your credit card has to figure out when did you actually make this payment. And that's not always on the day the payment is due, right? Sometimes you pay earlier than the due date, sometimes a little later than the due date, depending on the mail or your computer speed for doing the transfer. But if your payment arrives 5 days early, am I allowed to charge you those 5 days worth of interest? That's against the law. So I have to pull that piece. I have to make the interest calculation match the number of days I actually loaned you the money. If I'm doing a daily rate, that's easy. But if I'm doing a monthly rate, that's much harder. I can use the equivalent daily rate, or I use the force of interest. And that becomes a faster calculation in most systems. Questions? %99 of the time, we'll think discretely. We won't use this calculus idea, but it shows up just often enough that I need to know. I apologize in advance for any potential political implications of what I'm about to discuss. What is the definition of inflation? I mean, we can get a formal definition, but we can also get a practical definition. What does it mean if I say inflation is 2% this month? The price of things is going up, approximately 2%, right? So that means that a dollar in August paid for more than a dollar in September. The value of my dollar went down if inflation goes up. That's a change in the price of the value of money. Isn't that exactly what interest rates are? Interest rates allow my money to build up over time. Inflation takes away some of that value. Now, how do we figure out what inflation rate is? The inflation rate is based off of the cost of a list of particular items. The definition of the consumer price index, just taken right from Wikipedia, tells me what things, where's my list of things? Here we are, for many items. The consumer price index, oh, that's not legible. The consumer price index uses a bunch of different categories, as we see over here on this picture on the left, that include things like transportation costs, housing costs, food, excluding alcohol. Alcohol is a separate category, but there are a bunch of different things. By the way, if we take out food and energy, that's called the core consumer price index. But we can say, oh, prices went up this much, and we turn that into an annual rate, and then we have an inflation rate. But something that usually happens is that when inflation is high, interest rates go with it. When inflation is low, interest rates stay low. So measurement of inflation is important to determining fiscal policy. So let me think about this. How do I determine what I really made? Let's consider a simple investment. I'll make a nice, easy investment. I invest $1,000 at 5%. I'm going to make this compounded annually. What do I have at the end of a year? In addition, my interest is $50. So I end up with a future value of $1,050. But let's run with the inflation rate. The inflation rate is 3%. If the inflation rate was 3%, then the price of everything went up. And the prices changed. So the things I could buy for $1,000 a year ago will cost me how much today? Aha. So really, did I make $50? Well, not really. Because that $50 doesn't buy $50 more worth of stuff. It only buys the proportionally larger amount of stuff to a base value of $1,030 instead of a base value of 1,000. So I can adjust for this. Normally you'd say, well, subtract the two, you really only made 20 bucks. But that's not always exact. The inflation adjustment rate, inflation adjusted return on investment. I need two things. I need an interest rate. I. Here's where I'm going to use the difference, Maria. They're going to use I and R. This makes me crazy. And by the way, on the AgTech book, you'll see them use I and K for just that reason. So if you look at the formula sheet on the AgTech formula sheet, you'll see I and K instead of I and R. But I'm going to run with what the book uses right here at the moment. Annual interest rate, annual inflation rate, R. Then the real rate of interest, or the inflation adjusted rate, is I subscript the word real, I minus R over I plus R. 1 plus R. 1 plus R, not I. Now, why does that make sense in conjunction with what we were just talking about? I said my $1,050 investment doesn't pay for $50 more worth of stuff because I'm not comparing it to the $1,000 price. I'm comparing it to the new price of $1,030. So let's take a look at this calculation based on these numbers up here. The numbers I just pulled out of thin air. I had an I of 0.05 and an R of 0.03. But if that's the case, then I real 0.05 minus 0.03, there's the $20, and then I divide by 1.03, which is or 1.94%. So in spite of the fact that on paper, my return on investment was 5%, once I take inflation into account, my return on investment was actually less than 2%. Not just 0.05 minus 0.03, it was less than that because of the increase in costs and services. Now, this is assuming a moderate interest rate and a moderate inflation rate. If you go back 5 years, the inflation rate was somewhere around 20%, not 2 or 3. And interest rates were in the tank. What happens if the interest rate is lower than the inflation rate? I lose money because that makes this fraction negative. And that's one of the problems of higher inflation rates is that we actually will outpace great earnings. And that means the money you have is less valuable. When inflation is small, this number is pretty close to 1. So using I minus R isn't a bad idea. But when inflation is big, we have huge problems. By the way, we saw periods of hyperinflation in the last 100 years. Right after World War I in Germany, the rate of inflation was approximately, brace for it, 200 billion%. Prices went up so fast that they literally couldn't print enough money to buy stuff. In Hungary in 1946, just after World War II, 4 times 10 to the 18th percent. Wait a minute. 10 to the 9th is billion. 10 to the 12th is trillion. 10 to the 15th is quadrillion. 10 to the 18th is quintillion percentages. Stuff went up to the point where it just became impossible to keep up with. In Yugoslavia in the 1990s, inflation reached 10 to the 27th power percentage annually. They stopped paying for things in money with dollar denominations. They paid for stuff by weight. A gram of money bought you a gram of bread. A kilo of money paid for a kilo of sugar. They didn't bother. In Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, 2008, inflation hit 10 to the 20th. They were printing bills with expiration dates on them. They had, I wish I was making this up, a former professor here came back from a trip to Africa with $1 trillion bill. It expired 6 months after it was printed. 6 months after it was printed, that $1 trillion was worth $1. They chopped off 15 zeros in 6 months. I want you to imagine a bag of money, a cubic foot of money. This box, fill it with dollar bills. Next week, that box is worth $1. That's how fast inflation was going. That's one of the risks of inflationary behavior. So what do we do to counter inflation? We adjust the interest rates themselves. If that money is hard to come by, it'll cost you a lot to pay it back, then money becomes scarce. There isn't as much of it. You can't keep charging more and more for prices. So these interest rates and inflationary behavior are usually tied very close together. And what we have is the ability to use force of interest to modify inflation rate. By the way, in the United States, that's the job of the Federal Reserve Bank. Unfortunately, right now, there's a political contest between the White House and the members of the Federal Reserve Board, and they don't like each other. So there's a lot of yelling back and forth there. You should do it this way. That's not good policy, but that's what I want. I don't care. Those arguments are going to go all the way to the Supreme Court in the next 3 months. So I love to tell you this is useless shit, but this is your future right now. Pay attention. Inflation is often based on the past year, but interest rates are based on the idea moving forward. So there's a little bit of tension here between what we want to see in the future and what we have seen in the past. And so we estimate and project inflation rates forward to try and account for this. I'm sure somewhere there are people with huge degrees in economics and finance who know a lot more about the whys and wherefores of how to tweak monetary policy precisely. All I can do is tell you this is what has happened. Be aware. Questions? Talk to me.
Once taken out, the interest rate that's been set for that, it just stays, like, no matter, like, it doesn't change with inflation, it just stays.
That depends. There are multiple different kinds of loans. A lot of loans are fixed rate. I'm going to pay 7%. I'm done. For the rest of the life of this loan, I'm paying 7%. But I know for a fact my credit card can change its interest rate as long as they give me 90 days notice. So I was borrowing at 10%, and then they changed the rate, and now it's 18%. Oh, and by the way, if you miss a payment, it's 26% for at least a year. And if you don't miss any payments, we'll drop it back to 18. Home loans, mortgages. You can buy fixed mortgages. Same interest rate the entire 15 years, 30 years, 10 years. You can buy a rate that adjusts. How often does it adjust? Sometimes they adjust every 6 months, every once a year, or every 2 years, depending on the loan you take out. And then you have already signed the agreement, but there's usually in the text there some sort of maximum jump they can make. Recent regulations said for credit cards, you can't jump the rate more than 10% without clear advanced notification as a penalty. So my credit card was at 10%, and it said right there, if you miss a payment, the rate moving forward will be 26% for at least 1 calendar year. Flat. All I had to do was be late once. my rate jumped. That's a huge jump, 16 percentage points jump. But they told me, and I'd signed the paperwork, so I was bound by it. I wasn't late. I was pretty happy with that. But a year later, they sent out an announcement saying, we're going to raise the rates for all borrowing by 8 points. And we went from 10 to 18. The late went from 26 to 34. It's always negotiable. And if you don't contest it or close the account or say, I want to renegotiate this loan, you're bound by the agreement you signed. So frequently, we look at what kind of loan. I like fixed rate loans. My entire life, I have tried to use fixed rate loans wherever possible. The only varying rate I've ever used is a credit card. But a lot of people buy home loans on adjustable rate behaviors. And you'll get, I'm paying 4% on my mortgage, but it can adjust every year by as much as 2% in either direction. And we've seen mortgage rates go down some years, and then the adjustable rate mortgage went down. And then you see years where mortgage rates go up and the adjustable rate goes up. And that means all of a sudden I could have been paying 5, 6%, but now I'm paying 8, 9% 2 years later. How do we account for that? It's scary. And that's why I'm like, give me a fixed payment so I know how much I'm doing every month for 10 years. I can do that. Car loans tend to be fixed payments. Rent-A-Center, places like that where you put stuff on loan payments like that, those are usually fixed rate payments. You're going to pay the same percentage rate, so we know how much you're going to pay every month. We'll have to figure out how to calculate those items. I promise we're getting there. We're getting really close to that one. More questions? The problem with a fixed rate loan is it ignores inflation. Yeah. The benefit to a fixed rate loan is it ignores inflation. So if I'm paying stuff, I'm really happy to do a fixed rate. If I'm earning stuff, I'm a little less happy. So what are the things that can change interest rates? I mean, just ignoring inflation for a moment, let's just talk about the interest rate itself, because that's decidable. Interest is the cost you pay to borrow money. It's the benefit you get from loaning someone else money. So who borrows? Who borrows money? Well, we've seen giant corporations will borrow money for very short periods of time to float loans like that. People borrow money. I'm going to buy a house. I don't have $250,000 in my pocket. I'll borrow money to pay off the house. A payday loan, a credit card, student loans, anything I'm buying that's not immediately in my pocket, I'll probably end up borrowing something. Companies borrow, startup costs, private venture capital, short-term loans, long-term loans, government bonds are really loans. They're borrowing. They're borrowing from the public, but they're borrowing. Who lends? Well, banks lend, right? But the bank lends because you've loaned it your money and they're paying you interest. Some companies lend because they've got a pile of money and they want to make something out of it. They'll put out a lending idea. So there are a lot of different ways to get money out into the system and to get money from the system, depending on who you are. Government policy sets some rates. Banks must maintain a certain level of liquid capital on hand. You must have a certain amount of cash in hand. The Federal Reserve Act, there's a link on our website that says, here's the minimum amount. If you're a bank with this many people, you have to have this much per person on hand, or this many accounts of this size. And it depends on whether the accounts are big or small as to how much you have to have. If you've got a bunch of small accounts, you must have a certain percentage of that money available at all times. This is to prevent a bank run. Bunch of people walk into the bank and want their money. What happens when the bank runs out of cash? I'm sorry, I can't give you your money back. That's illegal. But they can say, we won't have the cash until tomorrow. We'll do an overnight loan. We'll get some cash brought in. We'll give you your cash. But there's got to be a minimum in there. So if I adjust the interest rate to make it easier or harder to lend money, I may need to change that requirement. Say, oh, I've given, my problem is I don't have your money because I gave it to Joe to run his business and he owes me that back tomorrow and I'll be able to give it to you then, but the money's not in my hands right now. A percentage of it is. Federal fund rates, the overnight rate being the best one, affects the rate the bank charges you as a customer or the bank pays you as a depositor. On our Canvas page, oop, wrong button. That one. Please take me to the right class. Yes. Links. The Federal Reserve economic data will give you a list of what that overnight rate has been. There's a chart on page 46 that gives me some of them for the past few years. This came from that website, the Fred website. You can even see it says right there. Federal Reserve economic data. That's why I'm calling it Fred. But that's out of the St. Louis Federal Reserve, and that's the link on our Canvas page. You could get this exact piece. There are some shaded regions here. Those shaded regions are recessions. And what you're seeing here is the inflation rate and the federal funds rate. Those are the two different graphs here. I think the lighter one is the federal funds rate, and this more jagged one is the inflation rate because that's measured off of actual data. So it's got more precise variation going on. And so as you'll notice those graphs are really in parallel. And by the way, you see right here, where's the inflation rate? That's after the 2008 housing crash. The inflation rate is 0. They pushed it down. The federal lending rate went to 0. They wanted money in the system. And here we see the same thing again. What happened right after right in the middle of 2020? We shut down the world. Hey, let's get the money moving. We'll make it easy to borrow money. So I can use real data. Now, I would like to actually say that we have a goal. We would like to see a particular inflation rate. Because if we see that particular inflation rate, then I know I'm earning money. I know my goods and items are more valuable. My house, I buy a house at $50,000. If inflation is 2%, then that's worth $51,000 a year later. $51 a year after that. My house gets more valuable. My stuff gets worth more as time goes on with a fixed inflation rate. So I aim to have growth in my economy, to have a particular inflation rate, and then to adjust interest rates to make it work. At the same time, there's a risk involved. What happens? Your money's not in the bank because I gave it to Joe and Joe owes it to me tomorrow. What happens when tomorrow comes and Joe doesn't? So in the midst of all of this is something called a risk premium. The prime lending rate is for the best borrowers. Borrowers I am 100% convinced will pay me back the money. Now, usually that's the federal rate with a little bit of a cushion. So if the federal government is saying that the interest rate for borrowing money from the Fed is 3%, then this will be like 5 or 6%. That cushion is a little bit variable, depends on the bank. So if you are a AAA rated great person, and I believe you will always pay back your loans, I'll lend you money at this rate. By the way, if I'm between banks, banks usually trust each other. They'll lend money right about this rate, or maybe even a little lower. They'll get you a better deal. If I have someone I think is a risk, then I can't give them this loan. I bump up the rate a little. Housing market again. In 2008, when the housing crisis occurred, it was a crisis of subprime loans. The phrase subprime here doesn't mean below prime. It actually means above prime rate, but it means that the people weren't good enough to earn the prime rate. They were subprime borrowers. So it was actually referring to the people about whom took the loan, not the rates themselves. So a subprime loan is usually a higher rate. Because the borrower is less than optimal. See, the phrase up here says best. So the sub here refers to them being less than best. So you can look at a credit rating. And if you're not a AAA high credit person, maybe you're a AA or an A. The rate's going to go up a little bit because of that. I can build a risk premium because I expect there may be some people who don't actually pay it back. And if I bump up the rate, I'll still make the right amount of money to cover it of everything else. Treasury bills, savings bonds, they all have a certain amount of risk associated with them. The higher the risk, the higher the rate needs to be to entice people to make that investment. If I told you that you had a 99% chance of getting your money back, would you give me $100 if I promised you the $100 back tomorrow? 99% chance. If I do this for 1,000 people, I got $100,000 now, right? So now I sit down and I start rolling dice. And if it comes up 00 on a set of dice that go from 0 to 100, you don't get your money back. I should expect 10 people not to get paid. They're going to be pissed off, aren't they? The rest people won't care. But there needs to be a trade-off there. It doesn't pay for people to say, oh, maybe I won't get my money back. Maybe you should make me a better offer. You're not just going to give me $100, you'll give me $102 or $103. I'll make some money for the risk associated of putting this in place. Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch's are the three main credit rating companies. And they decide who's a great risk, who's guaranteed best borrower and who's not. Ratings go from AAA all the way down to C and junk status. A junk bond might have a 30% chance of getting your money back, or a 40% chance of getting your money back, or worse. And so you need to be careful. There's a listing on the S&P website that goes through what the bond rankings are for bond agencies. They go through credit ratings for companies the same way. The US government went from AAA to AA in 2011. Standard & Poor changed the rating right after the 2008 housing crisis. Fitch's waited until 2023 to make that same change. Standard & Poor made it this year, we are no longer a AAA rated company. We're a AA rated company, which means other countries charge us higher rates to loan us money. They think we're a little bit riskier than we used to be. Risky borrowers get charged higher rates. Your first credit card is almost always at a higher rate than the credit card you get 10 years later. Your insurance rates do the same thing. When you are a brand new driver, your auto insurance is, but then it goes down. Usually right about the age 25. Risky borrowers may not pay you back. We want to work around that. This has been a very broad overview chapter. There's a lot of different terminology here. There's a lot of different formulations. I really want to get into some of the nitty-gritty here. I want to know, all right, I took a loan. If I'm going to make a fixed rate loan, how do I determine what the payment is? Or if I know I want to pay it back, if the person says you're going to owe me this much, what's the interest rate they're charging? By the way, when you buy a house, the average price of a house in this area is somewhere around 185, let's just call it $200,000. If you're paying, do you have $200,000? Me neither. You used to be able to borrow from a bank $200,000 and pay back whatever you could every month for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, you had to pay what was left. It's called a balloon payment because it's much higher than all the other payments. Nowadays, instead of being a 5-year term, it's a 30 or a 15-year term. You buy a house for $200,000 and you're going to pay it off over 30 years. Well, then the payments will stay the same the whole way through. How much are they? It's a good question. What's the interest rate? Well, right now the interest rate's around 6%. Now I got to do all the value of time, but I'm paying stuff off in the middle, so they charge me a little less interest as I pay stuff down, right? I got to work out how to do this. That's where we'll start next week. We'll actually get into the nitty-gritty of some of these valuations and loan repayments. But that means we finished chapter 1. Now, there are 2 important things here. There's a homework set due in a week. That's the 11th. And there's an exam the Tuesday after. Problem number 1, this is the first time I've taught this course. I have no exam prep worked out yet. So I don't have a study guide for it, which means I am going to make the exam very close to the homework questions. When you turn stuff in next week, I will post those homework keys. You'll have a complete list of every problem solution I've come up with, written out nicely, and you'll be able to then use those as a study basis for you. Numbers have changed, ideas will be. The exam will have to be reasonably completable within the class period. I don't want this to blow your minds. I really don't. But I want you to be able to tell me what you know. So in addition to getting those 4 pages from the ACTEC formula sheet, you'll be able to make one of your own. Because I know for a fact this is not a trivial set of formulas. If you want to talk to me about the formula sheet in more detail, I'll be happy to do that. I'm heading over to office hours right now. I will see you all on Tuesday. Have a wonderful rest of your day.